Welcome to the Hockey Physiotherapy Podcast with Ben Dooley and Thomas Scar. Before we get into the topic, we'd like to thank you for listening, and if you could, please give us a review on your podcast platform and follow us on Instagram at the Hockey Physiotherapy Podcast and on X at Hockey Physio Pod. Please give us any feedback at the hockeyphysiopod@gmail.com.
Ryan, thanks so much for coming on. We wanted to give you a medium to share your research because it's fantastic, and just wanted to ask you a few questions about it. Can you just give us a little bit of an intro on yourself and what your career goals are and what your research at McGill has focused on thus far?
Yeah, so career goals, after doing research and doing my master's, I've kind of decided I don't necessarily like the path of testing products. I kind of want to go more into product development, actually. So I'm doing a technical diploma this upcoming year in Milan to kind of learn 3D CAD and all of that, and hopefully eventually get into more like skate development. That's the end goal.
Oh, wonderful. That's really cool.
That's awesome.
I feel like that'll be a whole other conversation because I don't know anything about that. But yeah, so and then you're like growing up, what did you do for sport? What were your interests? What
Yeah,
kind of led
so
you down this path?
yeah, I've been a figure skater for over 20 years, and that kind of started my research actually. So that's the whole reason I went to McGill is there was a figure skating team. There's not a whole lot of figure skating in Texas, so went
Yeah.
up north. And then I was actually able in my last year of my undergrad to do research with the Ice Hockey Research Group, which is where I also did my master's. And I did an undergrad research practicum on comparing figure skating jump techniques. So I was comparing when you have both arms above your head during a double jump versus when you just cross your arms. So yeah, and I was looking at angular velocity and accelerations to see if one technique was better than the other one. And then I really enjoyed it. The lab has a great atmosphere. That research is super interesting, getting to collaborate with Bauer. So then I did my master's. Yeah, and we were it was unfortunate a bit. We didn't have ice because our arena was closed. So I had used previously collected data, but it was
Oh,
still
fair.
super cool. So we got to do the backward skating, which, as you've seen, isn't really looked at very much. So,
Yeah, awesome though. So everybody, for people listening or who haven't read your thesis, can you just give us a little bit about an understanding of that, what like the abstract would be like, and maybe we can go from there?
yeah, so the research, basically we're trying to understand more about sex differences in males versus females in hockey, as the PWHL is gaining a lot of popularity and professional women's hockey is growing, and women's hockey in general is growing. So we wanted to kind of explore a bit more that had never been like women had never been included in a backward skating research study. So we thought it would be interesting to do a comparison to see if the mechanics are different or if they're similar, based on different sex papers that we've done in the lab. We've seen sex differences in like stop and go tasks, in forward strides, in steady state skating as well. So curious to see if that's the case in backward skating. So yeah, that's kind of the whole reason we did the project. And then in terms of the findings, we had skaters do their natural backward skating patterns. So basically from that, then we cut out the backward C-cut sections from the trials. We used the McGill varsity teams and then just a few skaters in the area that we had access to. And then we were comparing their joint coordination as well as looking at their joint kinematics and also doing some cycle time differences to see if there's difference. And we found that there are differences, not so much sex-based for the coordination, but in the joint kinematics themselves, there were differences between males and females. And then we actually found that there were no differences between the cycle time, so one C-cut cycle between males and females. So
Right.
interesting findings.
Very interesting. And like that leads into my next question about, and maybe this is more something you're looking into with your next part of your career path, but females showed more hip adduction, more upright mechanics, right? So, and then males showed deeper hip and knee flexion mechanics. My question really is then like, how could things like boot stiffness, pitch, or cuff height be modified to support these tendencies? Or is that something that is like, should we not go down that route? Should we try and teach them to skate differently?
So with the question of the actual equipment, I guess, I think it really depends. Like if you're looking at the upright posture, um, I'm probably assuming that the center of pressure is going to be more in the middle of the foot, whereas if you're leaning forward more during the C cuts, which we saw in the male skaters, they're probably more on the balls of their feet. So I think definitely in terms of the pitch, potentially even of the boot, not necessarily just the blade, could influence that as well.
Mhm.
It depends what route you want to do. If you want to correct more the female side of it and give them like more of a pitch so they get onto the balls of their feet, so then they have more of a forward lean, you could do that. I think in general, the cuff height, like the ankle support, needs to be reduced in general.
Mhm.
I think it's really dangerous to have an overly stiff boot in
Mhm.
a lot of cases, and you want to have a lot of ankle flexion because we see that for performance measures that being able to really reach your maximal range of motion is really important for performance.
And I think in your research, was it the sensor wasn't working on the boot, like for the ankle?
So it when we were looking at some of the joint angles, there were some issues with a lot of noise we were getting from the sensors that it
Right.
wasn't necessarily from the skating, and so we kinda had to scrap the ankle.
Yeah, fair
I
enough.
would have loved to see I would have loved to
Yeah.
see the ankle motion differences. And then there's just some issues, like having the boot putting the sensor on the boot because it's not necessarily validated to put on top of a boot because that's not
Right.
necessarily
True.
true foot motion.
Yeah,
So that was
yeah,
the other kind
100%.
of issue, yeah, that I was worried about. So that's why we really just stuck with the knee and hip mechanics.
And I think
Fair
like this
enough.
is a paper that like I really think could create a lot more like exploration like in this field of study. So I think like that's just one small avenue that could be touched in terms of everything that you've covered with this, right? So no, it's awesome.
Yeah, you can like keep replicating these things and iterate from there. It's interesting that you talk about I think Ben, maybe you and I could speak to this, is like as physios, like we think of the other characteristics in return to play or return to performance. It's like a lot of the equipment side obviously plays a role with how people move. And I think sometimes, and I'll speak for myself, I forget about that a little bit. And maybe that's more conversations with equipment managers is actually very relevant. Um, I guess
Yeah,
Natalie, with your background of figure skating, you can probably talk a lot about the differences in skates as well and see what.
especially with the boots. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My next question for you, Natalie, is your study found that female skaters tend to use more knee and hip flexion, but are quite good with, or they don't do that, but they're quite good with their hip control. So then, from a learning and access to get them into deeper knee flexion, if we just extrapolated completely from your study, do we go down the avenue of teaching them how to skate differently, or do we try and off the ice alter that thought process or get them stronger in those areas to then therefore make them skate better? What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, from my point of view, we're looking at university level athletes. So these are athletes that have spent their whole life training and really like focusing on hockey. At least I think when we were looking at the experience, the lowest level of experience we had was 8 years of hockey. And
Mhm.
from my perspective, I think they probably have the optimized technique by that point. One thing I do want to point out is that I had 8 forwards. I believe I had 9. Yeah, I only had one defensive female in my whole study. So
Uh,
I don't know if the backward C cut technique from the females is the most representative of actual
uh,
backward C cut technique in female populations. But I think that by that point, we don't necessarily need to do technique corrections because I don't think that's going to be very beneficial for the athletes at the university level. Like I think for kids,
yeah,
definitely,
Yeah, that's
maybe
totally fair.
teenagers, but yeah.
Yeah,
right.
and you did mention that in your discussion too, like how this is just one population pretty much compared to like developmental versus recreational, et cetera. So
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And like you say, are we going to be able to change their technique substantially after millions of repetitions? So it's not just a motor control thing. So maybe you do, and people do off the ice. It gets a bit sketchy when we try to mimic skating, but maybe we can kind of steal some ideas from figure skating or strength and conditioning, and the speed skaters tend to do a lot of like low flexion, trunk positioning stuff. I'm sure there's some sort of carryover, but anyways, interesting stuff nonetheless, and it makes you think a bit differently, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Your findings showed like equal performance. I think you mentioned that earlier, despite different mechanics. So then, with that in mind, how do we tailor training without forcing men and women to skate identically, or what do we do? You know, like what's kind of the interpretation from that?
So basically, I was a bit limited as to the stuff that I could pull in terms of the actual timing between them because we didn't have a standardized backward skating test. So basically, we told our participants, and again, this was for a different study initially. So looking back now, we would have told them just do backward C cuts the whole way down. But now it was, so we were segmenting it. So basically, the only metric we could pull was cycle time. So looking at one left C cut, one right C cut. Um, and that was kind of our criteria. So we were looking at cycle time, and there was no statistically significant difference between the amount of time it took to complete a C cut on each foot.
Right.
And to follow up with that, the variability from like right leg and left leg, can you follow up on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we basically found that there was interlimb asymmetries. So with the right leg, most of the participants were right leg dominant, and we also saw that the right leg performance was stronger, I guess, than the left leg, or the left leg was more of a stable leg, whereas the right leg was the more propulsive leg, which was interesting to see that. So I think, again, we didn't only find like the sex-based differences, we just also found some interlimb, intralimb, interesting findings about like the push and the recovery phase of the C cut.
And from what you know, this is kind of like a lot of the first findings of this type of research, eh?
Yeah. Yeah. So not that many studies utilize the coordination measures. Like there's kind of two main ones we use in biomechanics, the vector coding as well as the CRP, which is continuous relative phase. So they're a bit different in their calculations, but we use continuous relative phase because there's a lot of sensitivity that you can find more sensitivity within the joints, which is important when you're looking at very minuscule, like 1-2 degree differences that can really make a difference. So yeah.
That's awesome. Today's episode is sponsored by SportsMap, the go-to spot for physios who want to level up their sport rehab game. They've got awesome courses, top instructors, and tons of practical info you can use right away in the clinic. They've been good enough to us to give us a code for our listeners, so use the promo code SMAP5HockeyPod at their website. SMAP5HockeyPod, the number 5. If you're looking to sharpen your skills and stay on top of the latest in sports info, check out SportsMap. Big thanks to them for supporting the Hockey Physiotherapy Podcast. Check them out at sportsmap.com.au.
Interesting. Do you think that some of the technology that you're using is like from a practitioner's perspective? So, for example, we rent ice, we take players out there, we test skating in a variety of ways. Do you find that, or do you think that some of the technology that you use during this Masters, like, could I go out and purchase some of these IMUs and would it be relevant, or are we not there yet?
So the system that we have, it's the XSense MVN Link suit system. That's what we used. That is a very expensive system. I think over $100,000 like worth of technology. So not really accessible for most practitioners or coaches. But I mean, I think there's some really new cool technology coming out with the markerless motion capture. Even just using OpenCap, for example, that's becoming really, it's very accessible. You just need 2 to 3 to 4 iPhone cameras, and you can get pretty like decently accurate, quick biomechanics measurements from skaters, which is really useful, I think. But in terms of gold standard, I mean, what systems are you guys using when you're doing data collection?
So like I've used like Vector Hockey, Matt Price, and them have why can't I think of the app right now? I use an app that I'm just gonna pull up my phone here. So I use a bit of an app here. Did I just lose the recording here?
No, you're good. You're good.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just on my phone, guys, as we do this. View Motion. View Motion is the app that I use, Natalie, and I think it's relevant. Sorry, that was ridiculous. Um, uh, so I think they use that in on track and field. It's kind of like a dart fish type app, and it's interesting. Like it gives you a big PDF from filming, and all you use is your iPhone, and you set it up on one angle, and you go from there, and it gives you a lot of relevant information, and then more of the evolved system just from timing gates. But very early in my own collection aspect. But yeah, it's kind of the practical things that we use.
Just to bring it back to the paper again a little bit, do you want to go over the limitations at all on it?
Yeah, so I mean, limitations are obviously like our participant population, I guess. We for the females, again, we had one defensive player, and then with males, it was a bit more even, which was nice, but we weren't able to actually do a forward versus defensive comparison, which I think that's an overall limitation of the study. I would have liked to see that, but actual limitations, again, like the system, the XN system, we don't have a global positioning system, so we can't get actual like positioning on the ice. We're just looking at the joint angles kind of as is, and we can't really get speed measurements, which I think is a limitation. Yeah.
Which are kind of good things like going forward again, which leads me to my next question. Like where would you like to go with this research? Like what do you want to do now?
Like, I would like to see this research. I think using markerless motion capture is going to be really important. I think after seeing the differences between males and females, I think we need to I would have actually wanted to step away and do more of a machine learning type of project where I can bucket skaters. So maybe have like 4 or 5 buckets of different types of skaters based on the C cut. So like maybe you have like an offensive defenseman versus like a true defenseman. Or a forward that has a lot of like very high level skating skills versus a forward that's just a rushing forward, like heading down forward. Yeah.
Would the idea then be to therefore influence their skating somehow, or what would what would be the next step from that after you bucket them, just to evaluate, or what would you kind of do with that?
Yeah, I think bucketing skaters to kind of have expectations, I guess, in terms of just technique. Looking at the joint angles, again, that kind of leads into the return to play, because if you have, let's say, a forward that never skates backwards, like does their range of motion going backwards really matter compared to their forward skating range of motion? Maybe pre and post injury type of thing.
Yeah.
I think that kind of stuff is really important. And yeah, I don't know. And then also just, again, like monitoring athletes. I think that's like an avenue that should be really more researched, because right now I think biomechanics, it's still very exploratory, just getting a basic understanding of technique, and there's not a lot of research on how to actually utilize some of the biomechanical tools practically. Like, how are practitioners going to use them? How can you use what information that we have and disseminate that knowledge? I think that's a huge limitation in biomechanics currently, specifically in ice hockey. It's growing. I think more and more NHL teams are getting biomechanists and using IMUs as tracking tools. But I think in terms of just like overall body mechanics, that's still that's not really looked at, I don't think, too often.
Well, it's just like
Go ahead, Tom.
Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, you kind of lead straight into that with like the NHL is very data driven now. Like everyone's very much so on the hockey nerd side of things. Numbers are really, really important. So I think all of like your research and research along that type of line is very important and will be more important going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say that the challenge of getting ice and then using it's just so hard because it's a cost, right? Versus like just going outside at a random field, and then a team has to hire and should hire and pay somebody like you a lot of money to then influence things. So I think gradually pro sports and college and just grassroots will adopt more of these things. That kind of, you talked a little bit about the profiling and monitoring aspect, Natalie. So that's kind of like interesting when you're talking about bucketing athletes into certain archetypes. So basically one of my questions was, could these patterns eventually be used to create a screening tool, for example, identifying athletes who are more knee flexion dominant as part of their injury prevention, or vice versa. I know it gets very murky when we try to talk about injury prevention or monitoring, but at least it's like, hey, if you're thinking about eventually, if you screened thousands of athletes and they're all in this type of archetype and you see more injuries in that, then that's therefore you can be like, hey, this is relevant information to look at to a coach or somebody.
No, I mean,
Interesting.
it's valuable. Like just to looking at those kinematics that again with the bucketing, I think really you can then predict what kind of injury someone's going to sustain if you can do some like maybe integrate the strength and conditioning component as well, like doing like muscle like some sort of muscle testing or it's just stuff like that, like strength testing, I think is really important to look at that because you see it in the kinematics first. Like if like a muscle's weakening or something like that, and you're gonna get some sort of knee injury or something, for example, like you can kind of you can preemptively see that before it happens and maybe try to prevent that.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because as physios or strength and conditioning people, we like will do some tests off ice, but like I think from the on ice, I try to now work backwards from the ice versus vice versa. Because obviously, if they can skate very well, then a lot of the stuff that we're looking at in the clinic probably doesn't matter nearly as much, right? So again, can't speak highly enough of the research that you guys are doing. One question that I had, Natalie, is backward skating is obviously massively under researched. We talked about this. Based on your data, what is like one of the misconceptions about teaching C cuts, or what can, with your skating background, like
Yeah.
any practical things that we can think about or apply on or off ice? Because Ben and I both help players on the ice from a coaching perspective too. So selfishly, I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, so actually I reached out to a few colleagues just because I don't have necessarily the best background for teaching backwards C cuts. Like in figure skating we call it a pump, and I know what I
Okay.
would for in a pump like to really monetize off of that because then you would progress from pumps into backward crossovers. But from like a defensive skating perspective, from what I understand, they're kind of moving away from the wide stance mini C cuts that we see that I was actually seeing quite a lot in the research. Like when I was looking at these videos and watching people, it was a wide stance mini C cut kind of motions back and forth, like this oscillating motion. And I've heard that it's kind of you want to actually teach it more like a question mark where you're pushing out and then really bringing your foot back in during that recovery to go straight back.
Uh-huh.
Because I mean, you're not really C cut. The purpose of a C cut, I think, is to maintain that backwards motion and that backwards speed and be
Uh-huh.
able to kind of like evaluate where your opponent who's coming forwards towards you, which direction they're going to change before you have to make a change of direction
Mhm.
movement
Yep.
yourself. So I think
Interesting.
focusing on that push and then bringing that foot straight back, so like a question mark shape, is what I think the direction is going to go with teaching C cuts.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. That's a good verbal cue though, to change the terminology, the question mark versus C, because a C is a different shape, obviously. So I think you can apply that to a lot of people.
In terms of like just from my figure skating perspective, I also think it would be really like beneficial for players to use like power pulls. I don't know if you guys ever practice those. It's on the one foot where you're cutting and like with an inside edge to an outside edge and
Yep.
alternating with edges on one foot. That's a
Uh-huh.
huge thing in figure skating we use
Uh,
forwards and backwards. But I think in general, from what I can see from certain things from like if your blade comes off your skate, if you can do power pulls to get off the ice, I think that's a
True.
beneficial skill
That's actually a good point.
as well as
so
just using that to learn how to cut more, like having to force your body to use that one leg to learn that cut, I think is beneficial too.
interesting. Yeah, that's what I was also wondering is, so when you talk about a pump, is it the same terminology, or what's the difference? Like, yeah, what's the difference between a pump and a question mark?
Yeah, no, so the pump is definitely like the beginning of a crossover, so that first push, and I think that is a true C cut. So you're doing that C motion with the push at the beginning and then the recovery before you bring your foot on top of your other foot to do that pump. So like usually we practice it just on a circle. So you're doing a bunch of pumps like backwards on a circle or forwards on a circle. But
Right.
yeah, to get used to pushing off of that one leg.
Right. Interesting. Very cool. Well, yeah. I think your research is wonderful. If anybody has any questions, how would they get in touch with you to ask more or to look further into the stuff that you're doing? Can they
Yeah,
reach out to you
so
via email or?
yeah, they can reach out to me via email. My email is natalie.schwartz@mail.mcgill.ca. You can also reach out to the McGill Ice Hockey Research Group. We're a group out of McGill in the Kinesiology and Physical Education Department. Most of our research is funded by Bauer, so we collaborate with them on a lot of projects.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, look forward to hearing more about your future endeavors in Italy. I hope you have a great time there. How long will you? How long will that take? Will that be a big time period, or what's
Yeah.
the situation?
So for 10 months, and then hopefully we'll see whichever skate manufacturing company needs a new skate developer. Yeah.
Sounds
Okay,
like it.
cool. Well, we'll have to have you
Congratulations.
on in a few years then. That's we'll ask you about what's new and go from there.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you guys so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Have a good holiday.
We'd like to thank you for listening to the Hockey Physiotherapy Podcast. If you could, please give us a review and a follow on your podcast platform. Please give us any feedback as well at thehockeyphysiopod@gmail.com. Check us out on Instagram at the Hockey Physiotherapy Podcast and on X at Hockey Physio Pod.